We're going to talk about the third and final component of our waves, currents, and tides standard. Our main learning target is I will analyze and interpret data to create graphic representations of the causes and effects of waves, currents, and tides in Earth systems. So, we're going to talk about tides. Tides are the rise and fall of the surface levels of Earth's ocean water due to gravitational effects of the sun and the moon. So in this case, the sun, the moon, and the Earth are going to work together, and that creates tides. As the moon orbits the Earth, the water that's closest to the moon and on the opposite side of the Earth bulge outward, making a high tide, and locations in between experience low tides as water recedes. So what's happening is the moon has a gravitational pull on the Earth, and it affects our water levels. So the moon, when it's lined up with the Earth, is going to pull on our water levels and make us experience a high tide. The areas that are not aligned with the moon at that time are not going to experience a high tide. They're going to be lower. Think of it as if you're pulling a lot on one side, you don't have a lot left on another part of the world. Generally, every beach experiences 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. So no matter what, every day there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides. Sometimes there are higher than high tides and lower than low tides, and that happens during a spring tide. When the sun and the moon and the Earth are in line with each other, the gravitational pull is in the same direction. So those high tides are higher. It's a stronger gravitational pull. You have the sun that's pulling and the moon that's pulling, all on this water level. So we're going to get really, really high tides, which is going to result in our low tides being extra low. This occurs about every 14 days. Think about the moon phases that are occurring when there's a spring tide, when the sun, the moon, and the Earth are in line with each other. Then we have neap tides. That's when we can expect our high tides are not as high and our low tides are a little bit higher than normal. Neap tides occur when the sun and the moon are at right angles to each other. The gravitational pulls are not in the same direction. So the sun is pulling and the moon is pulling in different areas. So that's going to make the high tides not be as high. They're going to be lower than expected, but low tides are going to be a little bit higher than expected. So during a new moon, we will notice a spring tide. Okay, so we'll have a solar tide, it's pulling. The lunar tide, it's also pulling on the Earth. And the sun, the moon, and the Earth are in line with each other. During a first quarter moon, we'll experience a neap tide. The sun, moon, and Earth are at right angles. So notice where the solar tide is pulling and where the lunar tide is pulling. So you're having lower high tides. Then at a full moon, we'll expect a spring tide once again. Look at where the solar tide is pulling and where the lunar tide is pulling. We have higher high tides because the sun, the moon, and the Earth are in line. And then we have the third quarter moon, where we're going to once again experience a neap tide because the sun, the moon, and the Earth are at right angles. Remember that every day there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides. Just that during spring tide and neap tide, the tide level changes.